What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny Bush and Edwin Porras of fantasypoints.com coming at you with some of the best fantasy analysis you guys are going to receive all offseason. We're going to be talking about injuries today, and injuries are some of the biggest reason why people lose fantasy leagues and win fantasy leagues every single year. So we got our injury expert, Dr. Edwin Porras of physical therapy, I believe is your doctorate. I'll let you intro yourself. But how you doing today, Edwin?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, guys. Doctor of Physical Therapy, you got it. You nailed it. I'm ready to talk some injuries, talk some sense into the masses about these injuries.
We are not going to waste any time right here because we know Edwin's got a tight schedule, a lot of injury analysis to be done this time of the season. So we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. So Edwin, this is the biggest question I got to ask you because this is a guy I've been higher on all offseason. I know you are higher on this guy, and I want you to tell the people why. What in the hell do we do with Saquon Barkley?
So I don't want to make it seem like there's no risk with Saquon, right? Because I know that I can get excited and it seems like there's no risk. There's some risk. 20% of players, 20% of skilled players since 2015 have some sort of either knee or soft tissue injury issue after the ACL tear 1 year after. So there's some risk there. There's also some risk that the Giants are just terrible and their offensive line isn't good, and Daniel Jones just isn't a good quarterback, and he can suffer there. There are a lot of pitfalls for Saquon Barkley, but when it comes to his specific performance, here's what we know. Obviously, generational. That word gets overused way too often, but Saquon Barkley is truly generational. He's got top-notch draft capital. He is in an organization that obviously is hanging their hat on him for the most part. They drafted him high, and he is one of the best running backs that is in the league. So, coupled with the fact that he's a freak athlete, is the fact that he it has 10 and a half months to recover from this injury. Now, we do know that it takes at least 9 months for these dudes to get back onto the field. Saquon's going to have at least 10 and a half months to get back to his form. Can he do that? Yeah, I think so. And if we look back at the end of 2021, and Saquon is like a top 2 or 3 running back, what are we going to say? Like, are we going to be surprised? Like, are you genuinely going to be surprised? Like, no, right? He checks all the boxes to break the mold of what we consider ACL injuries to be. He is the walking definition of an outlier. So if you are like going to do the quadruple condom play and like do like Melvin Gordon in like the 8th round, like that's just not my style. Like we talk about all the time, we need to shoot for upside. Who has higher upside than one of the best running backs that's been in the league for like 10 years? Saquon Barkley, right? Like you got to go for the gold here. Don't do the quadruple condom play and fade Saquon.
I'll quickly say I'm glad you mentioned that because we've been preaching all offseason, and Pat Crane wrote a good article about this. But if you're taking a running back in the first round, you need one that has that league-winning ceiling to be able to put up 20, 22 fantasy points per game. And look, if Saquon Barkley is even 90, 95% of himself, he has that ceiling to be able to do so. You mentioned the target output. You mentioned the opportunity on the Giants in terms of his overall workload. I mean, the talent is there, the workload is there. And if the knee is fine, as you mentioned, by all means.
The last thing I'll say that I do think that things needs to be considered. It doesn't matter how logical we all are on this podcast. It doesn't matter how much sense it makes to us, how obvious it is. We know the Giants aren't a sharp organization. We know David Gettleman just traded back for the first time in his life this year. So we don't like, even though there's no objective medical reason to hold Saquon out, we know that, right? That doesn't mean that the Giants won't take him along slowly. Do I believe that happens? No. I mean, you heard Joe Judge just the other day get super excited about how he looked like against air, right? Joe Judge is just as excited to see Saquon in his first year with the Giants as anybody else. So I really think that we see him. But again, we can't predict rational coaching. We can't predict rational decision-making. But if we do assume that the Giants are at least sharp enough to put their best offensive player out there, then I think that we'll see Saquon in week 1, and I think he'll dominate.
And like you said, like Danny said, we need the legendary upside when we're drafting a running back in the first round. This reminds me a lot of the fact that, and it haunts me to this day, the fact that I passed on Dalvin Cook with the 6th overall pick in my fantasy draft last year. I still won the league, even though I took Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But passing on Dalvin Cook reminds me of passing on Saquon Barkley this year, because we had injury concerns. We had holdout concerns with Dalvin Cook last year, and he ended up being a league-winning running back, and none of us were actually shocked that it happened. Like you said, no one would be shocked if Saquon Barkley was a league-winning running back. You said go for gold. In my league, we only get paid if we win the league or if we come in second. So we need... we need that league-winning upside, or else we're not getting shit. Fourth place doesn't get us anything. So while we're on the monster that is the torn ACL, I want to get your rapid-fire thoughts on the other players that had torn ACLs this year. So we heard some mental complications come out about Joe Burrow the other day. What were your thoughts on that overall?
Yeah, man. I think that when we look at Joe Burrow, you have to consider this. He had an ACL tear, an MCL tear, a meniscus tear, and he had partial PCL damage, in addition to probably capsular damage. That's a massive injury. That's like ACL plus. No surgeon on this planet will put their athlete back on the field with at least 9 months of recovery from that injury. No surgeon on this planet. No PT will feel comfortable with that. Joe Burrow, by the time week 1 rolls around, is going to be 9 months and 10 days. I mean, talk about razor thin. That razor thin, cutting it close, comes into play now when we hear reports this week about him being mentally not there. When he's cutting it that close, he's thinking about all those things. Well, shoot, am I really ready? I mean, I'm cutting it really close. Can I really step and plant? Like, oh man, I don't want to get hit on the... And the thing about sort of dismissing the just mental, right? I'm doing the quotation marks, just mental, is that it manifests itself physically. It doesn't matter if he's physically ready. It's manifesting itself now. So if we're hearing Joe Burrow still isn't confident enough to step in and step into the pocket and make a throw, and we already said he's not going to play any preseason games, and we know that his 9 month mark is he's barely going to be there by week 1. I don't understand why we've been so adamant and that it's a slam dunk that he'll be ready by week 1. Like, I don't think it's a slam dunk, and I've been saying that since June, that he'll be ready for week 1. Can it happen? Yeah, absolutely. Can he overcome these mental struggles that he's having right now in camp? Yeah, he definitely can. What I'm saying is, from like a pragmatic perspective, if you've been all in on Joe Burrow, it's time to hedge your bets just a little bit. It's not a slam dunk. He'll be back by week 1. And that's sort of my thoughts there. Yeah,
no, definitely. That makes a ton of sense. And in general, like those major thin margins you're talking about, as you mentioned, the ACL, the PCL, it's not just a cookie cutter ACL tear. It's a complete knee, like just completely destroyed at that point. So, yeah, it's scary too in redraft, because when you're talking about Joe Burrow, he's not one of these Konami code quarterbacks. So realistically here, what are you taking in terms of upside? Because if he's at his ceiling, he's probably going to be, quarterback 6, quarterback 7. But with these mental complications, at the end of the day here, you're currently taking like quarterback 9, 10 off the board. It's risky. It's risky. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because, I'm looking in the 9th round right now. I'm contemplating Joe Burrow. I'm contemplating Ryan Tannehill. I'm contemplating like Jalen Hurts. And I'm looking at it. How many times out of that selection are you really going to be taking Joe Burrow?
Right. Yeah, and I think when we look at Joe Burrow in general, I think the big concern is all these fantasy assets that rely on Joe Burrow, right? Because we're taking with Joe Mixon and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and all these guys with the assumption that Joe Burrow is going to be on the field, and suddenly the bottom falls out of that offense if Joe Burrow's not on the field, and Joe Mixon's touchdown upside and Jamar Chase's connection with Joe Burrow going back to LSU, all that stuff fades to dust.
Exactly. I agree 100%.
Okay, so like I said, rapid fire on these ACL tears. Tarik Cohen doesn't sound like he's going to be ready right away, right?
No, he's not. And he's sort of, it's funny. It's not funny. I shouldn't say that. It's interesting, right? You have this dichotomy of Saquon Barkley and Tarik Cohen, totally polar opposite dudes. Tarik Cohen's 4th rounder. He's tiny. He's not as athletic. He's not the focal point of an offense. He doesn't have draft capital. So he's sort of on the total opposite end spectrum of Saquon Barkley. And I'm pretty sure his ACL tear, I could be wrong. I'd have to look into it more. I don't think it was much more complicated than an ACL, but you're seeing his rehab come along a lot more slowly. He tore his in week 3. Saquon tore his in week 2. I don't necessarily see him being quite ready for week 1 based on all the reports that you're hearing. I could be wrong on that. I'm going to be 100% transparent. I haven't looked into Tarik Cohen that much because I really honestly didn't expect much from him this year anyway. I think the biggest takeaway with this is that you can really lean on David Montgomery in like a best ball league. I know that David Montgomery, I feel like, is one of those dudes that's very, very polarizing. People either love him or hate him. And I think, but there's the one thing you can't argue is that he's going to have the opportunity there this year. Now, how good that offense will be, I guess that's yet to be seen.
Right. And the last two ACLs, Odell Beckham, Courtland Sutton, both of them sound like they both avoided the PUP list, or the active PUP as it's called. It doesn't sound like there's necessarily too much of a concern, although we did hear Vic Fangio say something about Sutton not confident in his cuts or something like that, something relating to that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, sort of comes back to like the Joe Burrow conversation. Sutton there were some reports, because that was, I think, like last week. And then this week you did see him step up, and there were some pretty cool highlights of Sutton finally getting comfortable in his own skin. We're having this conversation in August, right? Late July, early August. So like even with Burrow, it's not like the sky is falling yet, right? It is something to register though. And with Courtland Sutton, we saw he had a week. He was a little uncomfortable. Now we're seeing some highlight films. If this continues, you can be pretty confident in Courtland Sutton, because receivers have a much easier time coming back from this injury than something like running back, unless you're generational like Saquon Barkley. But when it comes to the mental side, it definitely manifests itself. If we hear, if it's the end of August, beginning of September, and, Sutton still isn't planning right, or, Courtland Sutton can't get his routes down, okay, then we're going to back up and take a second. But I think Sutton should come back. If there's one dude that I'm like micro worried about, I wouldn't even say worried. If I had to guess one player of these ACL tears who might fall into the soft tissue / knee injury report during the 2021 season, it's OBJ, because relatively speaking, right, this is all relative in the NFL, he's an older dude. The older that you get, the more likely you are to have complications because of surgical procedures, the more likely you are to have soft tissue strains anyway. His workloads have been up and down and up and down and up and down. So if there's one dude that I might be worried about, might miss a game or two, it would be OBJ. And he doesn't have the cleanest record, right? He doesn't have the cleanest bill of health. In addition to the fact that he's in an offense that wants to run the ball and just gave Nick Chubb all the money in the Brinks truck. So he's a dude that I am a little bit, I'm not sure how much upside is there with Odell anymore. Last year, I was definitely saying something different. I think that he can still return good value given his ADP. I think it's still like 4th or 5th round, if I remember correctly. So I think you could definitely get like some wide receiver 2 weeks from OBJ, but I just don't see the total ceiling like we used to see out of him, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's funny talking about OBJ, because we were here, we were way out on him last year. Like we had wanted nothing to do with him. He was a 3rd round pick. We just said no on that. We're like, no, thank you. And now, like, it seems like the market has been way over adjusting itself to the point where, yeah, you mentioned, I've seen him fall into like the 6th round. And at that point, I'm getting him as a mid wide receiver 3. I'm like, cool, best ball. If he's giving me usable weeks as a wide receiver 1 on what should be a good offense, by all means. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because, yeah, I do agree. Maybe the ceiling is wide receiver 12, wide receiver 14 overall. But I do think the floor is a good amount higher, again, if he's on the field. But you mentioned if he missed a couple of games here and there, you don't worry about that too much in best ball. So hopefully he can stay on the field for the majority of the season.
Yeah, and even before his ACL tear, he only had one good game against Danny's Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, of course.
So
where he threw a touchdown pass, right, or something.
Yeah. It's not like he was lighting up the stat sheet before that anyway. So off the ACL tears, let's go to the most recent news in terms of injury, which is the Colts duo, right? And this obviously directly affects Jonathan Taylor. It's going to affect Michael Pittman as well. Quenton Nelson and Carson Wentz, they're both dealing with, they both, I guess, underwent foot surgery. I heard Frank Reich on the Pat McAfee show say that Big Q's was genetic, what he did, and Carson Wentz's was a lot more simple, I suppose. Like I guess they just went in, pulled the bone out. I'll let you kind of elaborate on that, I guess.
So what I would guess, and this is totally speculation, what I would guess is that talking about Q's injury was probably a bone that he was like born with. Some people are born with extra bones in their feet. And this might have been the case for his, whereas Carson Wentz is an old chronic injury that happened in high school, allegedly. Now, the timeline was 5 to 12 weeks. There's one study showing, if we were going with what the Schefter report was, which is a metatarsal fracture, the average return to sport for those athletes in that study was it was a really small sample, so take it for what it's worth. It was 12 weeks. They did return to play, like practice, in 8 weeks. I'm expecting somewhere in between there for Carson Wentz, 6 to 8 weeks. I think I did my own show last night, and I think what I ended up saying, if you do the math from the day he had surgery, roughly week 3 or 4 And then today, Jay Glazer reported that it might be in the earlier part of the season. So that matches up there. So I think the soonest you could see Wentz back is about week 3 or 4, but you're really taking a gamble on a dude who looked just like walking trash at quarterback last year, right?
On the bright side, though, it's helping Jonathan Taylor's ADP dip to the mid to late second round. And again, when this guy, we still believe we mentioned the league winning upside shooting for that in the early portion of the draft if you're taking a running back. And he was going a little early. He was about a mid first round pick, but if he's going in that mid to late second round, and as you mentioned, Carson Wentz is only going to miss a couple games, let's just say, like, that's an absolute value dip for a guy that we do believe has that said league winning upside. I mean, this is a guy 25 half PPR points per game in those final 5 games down the stretch. So I'm glad to hear that it's on the Sooner side, because when you hear 5 to 12, when you think about it, when you contextualize it,
it's just a random number. Yeah. Yeah. It could be 1 year or it could be 10 years.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So that's good news for Jonathan Taylor. I've never been concerned about this injury for Jonathan Taylor. Does losing his best offensive lineman hurt him? I would argue the Quenton Nelson injury is much more significant than the Carson Wentz injury for Jonathan Taylor's output, because the big draw of him, of course, was that he's this elite running back with this breakaway speed against behind this great offensive line. And obviously Quenton Nelson, the best interior offensive lineman in the league for probably everybody's money, is now out probably for the next couple of weeks. Sounds like he's going to be back in 5 weeks based on his Instagram post, but I feel like every athlete probably thinks like that. So I'll trust the 6 to 8 week timeline that you kind of just laid out there. So speaking of a duo of teammates, real quick, your thoughts on Dak Prescott and Amari Cooper. It sounds like I'm going to try and pronounce this word, Latimus Strange. I can't even say it for Dak Prescott. And then ankle surgery / plantar fasciitis for Amari Cooper. I'm not really sure what's going on with him. Yeah.
So Dak Prescott, right? He had a latissimus dorsi strain. It's a really fancy word to say it's a huge back muscle. It's more of and they said it today. The Cowboys came out and said today, it's more of a baseball injury, because the motion of throwing a ball in general, that's adduction and like internal rotation. Those motions, that's what the lat is responsible for. And it's just a workload thing. I think this is just a workload injury for Dak. He's, getting back into the swing of things after being off the ankle in the first place. And then gets to camp. He just overdid it. His workloads were off, like I've mentioned before. I don't think it's a big deal. The Cowboys aren't treating it like it's a big deal. It doesn't sound like it's a big deal. So I think he'll be ready by week 1, and I'm not too concerned. Amari Cooper, a little different. I need to clarify right before I get in trouble again. I already got in trouble on Twitter. I don't know for a fact if this is correct about Amari Cooper. However, it's confirmed per Amari Cooper that he's had plantar fasciitis. He had it at least between 2015 and 2019. In 2019, he said that he played through it in 2015. That's essentially how we know that. And we know that he's had chronic foot and ankle issues. In January, he had a scope to remove bone spurs. Roughly 89% of people who have plantar fasciitis have bone spurs. So I'm deducing the fact that Amari Cooper might have plantar fasciitis and in addition have bone spurs, that he had them removed in January. In January, the scope should have taken not 6 months, not 7 months. Having inflammation in that foot today is not a good sign. And if I were drafting, and like, for example, Amari Cooper is towards the bottom half of my yellow light tier at my in my positional tiers for injuries, because you just don't know what's going on. Like, why is he still having inflammation in August from a scope in January? Does he have this chronic inflammation that's just not going to go away at this point? Amari Cooper's already known for having dud games. It's not that he doesn't have the upside, because we've seen the upside, but he is the definition of like a boom bust player. You're either getting a league winning week from Amari Cooper, or you need 5 points on Monday night and he's scoring you 3, right? Like, that's just Amari Cooper's style more so than other players, at least in my experience. So any other player that's in the tier that Amari Cooper's in, I'm probably going to take them first.
Yeah, and it makes sense because in general, it always seems like there's something going on with Amari Cooper. It's the foot last year, it's the foot again this year. There's always something lingering with him, and I'm glad you mentioned moving him within the tier. Now, you wouldn't say, oh, because of this, you're taking a guy a tier below him or anything, would you?
It depends. It depends on who you're looking at. Yeah. I think that, if you're going to, I don't know, who do you think is comparable to Amari Cooper? Let's play
the guy over my right shoulder right now.
Mike Evans.
I'd take Mike Evans probably.
Okay.
I think I'd take Mike Evans.
Julio Jones.
I'd take Julio Jones.
How confident are you in his teammate? How much higher are you taking CeeDee Lamb because of this news?
I'm taking CeeDee Lamb a lot higher, I think, in like best ball, higher like larger field tournaments. This is definitely something that's making me like CeeDee Lamb a lot more. That's my answer. It's sort of didn't answer the question, but that's my answer.
That and the training camp highlights.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was enough for me. I was bought in before. Yeah, I was bought in for the training camp highlights.
For sure. Okay, so let's move off of the Cowboys and talk about the hamstring monster. Of course, we got to talk about this every offseason, but so far, knock on wood, we've got only a couple guys that have come, fallen victim to the hamstring. The biggest and most notable guy being Kenny Golladay. It sounds like he's expected to miss 2 to 3 weeks. It's being called a minor hamstring pull, suffered in practice this past week. And usually hamstring injuries are tricky. They're finicky. I remember last year we had you right on before the season, and the guy over my right shoulder, Mike Evans, was dealing with a hamstring injury going into the season and was effectively a decoy for the first 4 weeks of the season. So are we concerned about Kenny Golladay? And also Marquise Brown is supposedly dealing with this as well.
These guys have the entire preseason to rehab. So hopefully that by the time week 1 rolls around, they're okay. There is a 71% chance this is going to recur again based on historical data between 2016 and 2019. But that does not mean that it's going to recur and all of a sudden they're going to miss 3 games, right? It sounds like Kenny Golladay has a pretty run-of-the-mill grade 2 hamstring strain that if it were to be in season, he'd probably miss 2 games, a game or 2. But since it's a preseason, they're going to bring him along slowly. This is, again, another classic example of whoever you think's in a tier with Kenny Golladay, take all of those guys first, and then Kenny Golladay if you have to because of this hamstring strain. It doesn't mean like big picture fade Kenny Golladay, but again, it comes back to like that offense too, which is why this like offensive analysis is so important. What do you think that offense is even going to look like? There are reports that he and Daniel Jones weren't even on the same page. Now he's going to be off the field for 2 weeks. So it's a mess in New York, man. Like it's a mess in New York. And who do you think is going to eat up all those targets?
My answer is Saquon Barkley, and that's really the only one. Honestly, the only one I want. I know everybody's pumping the Evan Ingram train. Like, get out of here. Like, I don't. If Evan Ingram gets 100 targets again, was he going to score 1 touchdown again this year? Like, I don't care. Like, if Kenny Galladay's not on the field, I'm not drafting Sterling Shepard. I'm not drafting Darius Slayton. I'm not drafting Kadarius Toney. I'll just draft Saquon and move on with my life.
I'll quickly say one thing too. It's just hilarious when you think like Evan Ingram had 110 targets last year and had 1 touchdown, and Robert Tonyan had 58 and had 11 touchdowns.
Yeah, it was nuts. That was nuts.
It just goes to show, draft Saquon Barkley, and if Kenny Galladay's still lingering with this going into your draft, just take other guys out of him. Freaking right now, I have him ranked below Tyler Lockett, Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase. It's not even close at this point. Just take all those guys ahead of him in that tier.
Right. Okay. So from one minor injury, we got to go to a major one, unfortunately. And because this has got a big dynasty following, and unfortunately for our viewers, we were pumping this guy to no end. Anytime you guys asked us to trade Cam Akers or this guy, Cam Akers or that guy, our answer was almost always Cam Akers. So we apologize for all of you guys that own Cam Akers in Dynasty, but the Achilles tear is what I have called it is a death nail for running backs. It is definitely not something that we want to see for running backs. I'll put the image on the screen right now of all the running backs that have experienced Achilles injuries. Now, granted, a lot of these guys were older. We got guys most notably like Arian Foster, but the most recent example is rookie Deontay Foreman. He suffered it his rookie year and then wasn't really able to do much of anything ever since then. Sat out an entire season, in fact, in 2019. So is Cam Akers, do we have any cause for concern, or do we have any hope?
I think there's cause for concern. Let me list the reason for cause of concern first, and then we'll separate them into buckets. Cause for concern. Achilles ruptures are not the same as a ligament tear. Once the Achilles, which is one of the biggest tendons in the body, tears, you don't have the power, because the tendon is a part of the muscle. You don't have the power to do the motion that helps you sprint, jump, cut, everything. They're plantar flexors. The connection between the joint and the muscle, which puts all the force through the joint, is lost. Now you have to remodel that. The body never remodels it the same. Right? It's just like if you draw a squiggly line on a sheet of paper and then put the point right where you started, try to draw the exact same squiggly line. Almost impossible, right? That's really, really low level sort of analogy, but that's the body trying to remodel the tendon. because you don't have perfect remodeling, it's going to be really difficult for him to sort of run, jump, cut, be as fast and explosive as he was before. Physiologically, it's just not the same. Statistically, we look at the data. Corey, you mentioned it, that it's not the best, extrapolation. The data isn't as applicable to Cam Akers' situation. Those players were older. They didn't have as high draft capital. Maybe they weren't as athletic. It was, 10 years prior. So he's got light. There's some light at the end of the tunnel for Cam Akers, given his age. He's only 22. The Rams drafted him high. I think, what was he, like a second or third rounder? He's going to have the opportunity to come back, and it's going to take him a while, but he can get there. I think he'll still contribute. I think he can still be fantasy relevant, but just pragmatically, I cannot in good faith and in good conscience say, oh, Cam Akers is going to be back and be 100%. I have to take a step back and be objective and say, I think whatever ceiling you thought Cam Akers is, you have to bump that down by 10% at least until we see that he's able to overcome one of the worst injuries that an NFL player can sustain. So from your perspective, if say again, for obviously value pending, but if you're in a dynasty league, are you an active buyer, an active seller, or if you have them, you're just kind of holding and seeing what happens for the best? I think if you're rebuilding, I'd be willing to give up like a mid to high second round pick for him. I'm in a league where I'm objectively the worst freaking team in that league. I'm playing with Scott Barrett and Graham Barfield, and my team's just trash. So I'm just swinging for the fences everywhere. So I'm probably going to put some feelers out for Akers in that league. So places like that, I'm willing to buy. But I think if you're, a contender, or if you're sort of middle of the pack, you're probably just holding on. You're probably just holding on because you're probably not going to get the value back that you invested in the first place.
Right. And looking at Cam Akers' situation from a coaching perspective, it looks like, and it sounds by all accounts, that this was going to be the guy this year, right? Do you envision a scenario where Sean McVay, coming off of an Achilles injury next year, 2 years from now, however long he's on the Rams, is going to say, this is my guy? Or is he going to go back to his committee approach because he probably doesn't trust Cam Akers to hold up to a full workload after an injury like that? Maybe I'm just speculating, but is that something that could rationally happen, that not only do we not see him not reach a ceiling, he doesn't ever get a chance to be a feature back anymore. He's kind of a committee back for the rest of his career.
It's a very real thing. People talk about, for example, this is just an analogy, that, certain backs of a certain size can't handle a certain workload. That's not necessarily true. We just haven't seen it. Why? Because coaches don't think they can. So that plays huge. Like you were saying, decision-making is such a huge part. And you're 100% right. This goes back to the Saquon argument too. If you wanted to argue against us with Saquon, they could say, well, maybe the coaching staff just doesn't trust him, or maybe they don't want to give him too much of a workload, even if he's ready. That's totally reasonable. So it's the same logic applies to Cam Akers. If he comes back and Sean McVay, who is weirdly likes committees, for some reason, is just loves committees. Yeah, that's a very realistic possibility. And I think it was Jetpack Galileo said that too on Twitter, that the opportunity that he was likely to have this year might not be there when he's back. So that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah. Right. And that would be an ability thing, right? He'd probably have to just really wow the coaching staff for them to be able to trust him with something like that. And
right.
Thankfully, we have seen, and you said there is a light at the end of the tunnel, we have seen other athletes like Kevin Durant. We have seen, Marlon Mack, he's back to full strength in terms of he's practicing fully. OJ Howard on my Buccaneers also coming off an Achilles injury. So hopefully we can see some of these guys, and they're all young guys in their own right, come off of an Achilles injury, and hopefully they can perform enough to give us some more confidence about Cam Akers. But you mentioned the second round range. That's about the absolute apex of value I'm willing to give up for Cam Akers if I'm a buyer.
Yeah, we actually talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Say, okay, if you're a contender, what are you willing to, or if you're in a position to get Cam Akers, what are you willing to pay for him? Yeah, probably a mid to high second round pick. So it's kind of funny that we just both all agree on that type of valuation. But anyways, we can get on to the next injury. And this is a guy that we talked about on the show last offseason. And I know you've been very active on Twitter talking about the fact that the people that are fading Saquon Barkley for his injury issues, why aren't they fading Dalvin Cook? Because at the end of the day here, they both have the same level of concern, in your opinion. I'd want to elaborate. What is your thoughts on Dalvin Cook's shoulder?
Yeah, Corey mentioned it at the beginning too. Dalvin Cook's got this league-winning upside, and it's really difficult to pass on him, right? Which is why last year I was trying to be as careful as possible to say, I was trying not to say pass on Dalvin Cook. What I was saying is that you have to take a measured approach. So we know there's about a 40 to 50% recurrence rate in shoulder dislocations, and Dalvin Cook's had at least 3 since high school. The higher the amount of exposures, the more exposures he has to NFL contact, the more likely he is to have another dislocation. Obviously, it didn't happen last year. Won you a league. It's great, right? Like, so you have to take this measured approach. And really, I view this from like a 10,000 foot view. I'm not saying don't take Dalvin Cook. I'm saying maybe in a perfect world, if you're going to take Dalvin Cook in 9 out of 10 leagues, maybe bump it back to like 6 or 7 out of 10 leagues, if that makes sense. Like, the exposure to Dalvin Cook is more so what I'm trying to speak to, as opposed to like, just fade him. But there is a high recurrence rate for these injuries. And he's a year removed, so that helps. But then the exposures themselves aren't going to help either. So I'll just say that he is the lowest in my red light tier. The lowest like top running back in my tiers for running backs. So I'm not concerned, but I would say just be careful with your exposure to Dalvin Cook.
So it's more so like a macro idea, as opposed to like, if you're in one league, don't touch Dalvin Cook. It's more so like, as you mentioned, if you're in 100 leagues, just if you're at the second pick, don't take him in every single one.
Yes, okay. 100%. And exactly. If you're in one league, I wouldn't invest my pick in Dalvin Cook. If that's the only league you're in, I would go elsewhere.
Okay. Right. So if you have the second overall pick, you're in one, home league, work league, whatever. Who are you taking number 2 if you're not taking Dalvin Cook?
well, right now it's hard not to take Alvin Kamara, right? But I wouldn't be shy to take Saquon. I know where you're going with that, Corey. We're on the same page.
Okay, yeah, because if I see Saquon Barkley suit up for a preseason game, he's going to be my 102. Like, yeah. I've already kind of said that already, so I don't know if that's going to happen. I highly doubt it's going to happen, in fact. But if I see some kind of confirmation that he's going to be 100% Saquon by the start of the season, then I'm going to be all wheels up. Anyway, a guy that is not going to be 100% to start the season by all indications. And we talked about having late surgeries with Amari Cooper. Michael Thomas, for whatever reason, waited till June to have a surgery on what sounds like a deltoid, I believe is what he tore, the ligament inside of his ankle. And I know from listening to other fantasy docs, the high ankle sprain is the top of the ankle. The deltoid is the interior part of the ankle, which is a lot harder, I would assume, to actually tear. So what are our thoughts on Michael Thomas? Are we completely fading this dude? Does he have, a high chance of re-injury? What are the thoughts on Thomas?
Overall, I'm not in on Michael Thomas. I was going to try to explain and give a reason, rationale. There's no reason he should have waited this long for the surgery. It was a massive procedure. Now it's going to be 3 to 4 months for him to even be back on the field. That puts him at, if I remember correctly, that puts him roughly at week 6. He avoided the RPUP, so that's good. So week 5 or 6 is probably best case scenario for Michael Thomas. Even then, it's going to be a while for him to get his sea legs back under him. Best case scenario, he's like a league winner. Obviously, that's best case scenario, but I don't necessarily expect that to happen. This is just a totally. I don't want to touch the situation, I guess is what I'm saying. Even beyond the injury concerns, he sounds disgruntled with the team. It's just, it's not a situation I'm really willing to be a part of it. He's at the very bottom of my wide receiver tiers.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting when you think about it. And yeah, I'm in the same boat. If I'm looking at him in best ball, there are still people willing to take him in the top 8 rounds. And I just say, you're getting a guy at best, as you mentioned, week 7, even as we've been talking about all episode, even if he's ready to come back week 7, what if the coaching staff says, this is our number 1 wide receiver that we're paying $20 million a year for? Why are we going to rush him back in a season that, with a new quarterback, obviously with Drew Brees retired, whether it's Taysom Hill or Jameis Winston, they may not be as competitive because the offense simply isn't as good as it was with Drew Brees at the helm. There's no need to rush him back. So I do agree. I don't see the allure. I understand when Michael Thomas is playing and healthy, he's arguably a top 5 wide receiver in football, but you're not getting him for the first half of the season. And After that point, who says he's even going to play at all? I mean, we saw it last year with Kenny Golladay.
Saw with Deebo Samuel too. We had injury concerns going into the season with Deebo Samuel, and we never really got to see full Deebo Samuel. And I remember a number of years ago, I bought the injury dip on Doug Baldwin, and a lot of people did. And we all got burned because of it. And I think it was a hamstring pull that he had midway through training camp. And everyone was like, oh, Doug Baldwin's fallen to the 5th round. Let's snatch him up there. And this Michael Thomas situation, if I could hammer home any kind of point, I would just say, let some other sucker in your league take Michael Thomas. Yeah. And if you want to trade for him in week 4, maybe you could go ahead and do that. But I just wouldn't draft the guy because the chances of you drafting him higher than he's going to actually perform for you are pretty high.
Right.
All right, let's rapid fire these last couple. Joe Mixon apparently tweaked his ankle yesterday. I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on that.
I know that like, for example, like you talk about Jesse Morrison, he is down on Joe Mixon. I'm not. Joe Mixon has played 93% of his games since college. And his injuries have been fluky. The situation last year was very fluky, in my opinion. There are 2 systematic reviews that I've tweeted about that show after a midfoot sprain, which is ostensibly what Joe Mixon had last year. When they're stable, when there's no fracture, they don't need surgery. Players and athletes come back and they perform at a very high level. If you're concerned for him for like general foot and ankle issues, I can understand that, but I'm not really too concerned specifically for Joe Mixon. And I think he's going to eat. I think he's going to have a massive workload. And then the other guy, Antonio Gibson, I'm not too concerned. There's a little bit of concern, but I think that since Antonio Gibson himself came out and said, oh yeah, I'm still suffering from this turf toe from 6 months ago, I think Ron Rivera's coming in and trying to do some cleanup. He's trying to say like, hey, that's not how we do things. This is actually fine. Don't worry about it. Trying to downplay it a little bit. I'm not like super concerned from a 10,000 foot perspective, but what I would say is, just like I've been saying over and over, if there's a guy that you think is in a similar tier as Antonio Gibson, then I would take that guy. Even then, I still might lean Antonio Gibson just because he's so talented. And this might be a situation where the only, like, I don't want to say hard line, but really where I would say maybe fade Antonio Gibson would be like if you're in high stakes, large field tournaments and you're just like ceiling is everything. Maybe that's probably where I would avoid Antonio Gibson. And Devonta Smith, not worried.
All right. It's funny because I just want to quickly say I think Devonta Smith has the exact same injury that I had, so I wanted to bring that up.
I remember that. Yeah.
I thought it was torn, and then I ended up seeing it a week later. No, that was just the inflammation. You couldn't tell, but yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you love to see that. Devonta Smith's ADP probably going down a couple rounds because of this, and I'll take the discount on him. So, Edwin, we appreciate you joining us. Everyone, all of his work will be linked in the description. Fantasy Points, a great site. I've been, a subscriber there for a little bit of time, and I know Edwin puts out some free stuff that you guys can see. Even if you're not a subscriber, I'm not sure if you want to plug something that's free right now, you can go ahead and do that.
You know what? I'm going to plug instead my podcast, the Injury Prone Fantasy Football Podcast. Go check that out. I got to give that some love. I've been neglecting the poor little podcast, but thanks again, guys. I really appreciate you having me on. I told you before that I always prefer the OGs. You guys are some of the OGs, so thanks.
Appreciate that.
No worries. All right, everyone, peace out. Go ahead.
Last thing I'll say is, Edwin, you came onto our channel when we were at like 250, 300 subscribers. So appreciate us having that bond for this long time. So thank you for coming on.
Sure, guys. Thanks.
All right. Peace out, guys.
Why you need the money?